Jane Jackson runs the Bristol Grandparent Support Group, and we're talking to her about the support she gives grandparents who aren't able to see their grandchildren. She's telling us about their experiences and indeed her own experiences, and it makes for a very interesting talk. Jane, tell us about the Bristol Grandparent Support Group that you run.
Certainly, yes. In 2007, I found myself in the unenviable, horrible place of having lost contact with my granddaughter. We've been in her life for 7 years, and she came to us at Easter. We had a great time at Easter, usual things that you do with children with Easter egg hunts, etc. And that was the last time we saw her for 11 and a half years.
That's a long time.
Yeah, and I suppose I did what every grandparent does when they find themselves in this situation. First of all, you've never heard of it before. You think you are the only one.
Yeah.
And with that goes you feel ashamed, you feel bereft, you know, every emotion goes through you. But I'm quite a proactive person, and so I had two choices. I could sink or swim, and I'd started the sinking, of being low and depressed and just generally miserable. And so I decided I wasn't going to sink, I was going to swim. And I did a bit of research. And at that time, there didn't seem to be any support for grandparents that were going through the same thing that we were, my husband as well, obviously. And I found a statistic that said there were over 1 million grandparents in the United Kingdom denied contact with their grandchildren. So my reckoning was, if there was that number of grandparents, there must be somebody local to me who was going through the same thing. So I thought, okay, let's see if we can set up a support group locally. And so I did the usual, wrote to media and all that sort of thing, and didn't really get any interest. So I gave it one last go, and I wrote a letter to my local newspaper, which was entitled Tea and Cake for the Grandchildren. And I explained briefly that I was an estranged grandparent and that I would like to meet other grandparents if there were anyone in the Bristol area. And to my astonishment, 7 grandparents turned up at a date that I'd put in the letter. I hadn't seen them before, I'd never met them before. And so that was the beginning of Bristol Grandparent Support Group, really. And from those 7 grandparents, I've been contacted now almost 8,000 grandparents right across the UK.
Goodness.
It's obviously a huge untapped reservoir of people struggling with the situation, though.
Oh, it is and that's still the tip of the iceberg, because
bound to be.
What I now know is that grandparents are very reticent to contact support groups, because first of all, as a grandparent, I'm of a generation, you know, and that obviously makes a difference. That actually, you know, grandparents were people that you did seek advice from. The word respect was there, and I don't think that's quite the case now. But all grandparents, whenever they first contact me, will say, "Thank God I'm not alone," without exception, which is exactly where I came from. You know, that was my first feeling of, you know, it didn't happen to anybody else. But it is a massive, massive problem. And grandparents will have our contact number in their pockets for 6 months before they ring us.
Well, it's a great loss to grandparents, but it's also a great loss to children. And a great loss to, well, we're talking about grandchildren really, but also to the children.
Yes.
But the grandchildren lose something enormous in most families' lives, certainly traditionally.
Yes, they do. And I made a decision, really, I suppose, after I realised what I'd let myself in for, of what Bristol Grandparent Support Group was suddenly evolving into, that we wouldn't be under the banner of grandparents' rights. It was never, ever for us about grandparents' rights. It was about the rights of the grandchildren to have a continuing, caring and loving relationship with their grandparents after family breakdown in all its forms, because there's lots of different reasons why families break down.
Well, my experience in psychiatry, if I might just wander into that for a moment, is that children learn how to conduct relationships very early on in their lives, and their first experiences with family. And clearly, if you only have the experience of maybe one parent or one side of the family who may all have a similar pattern of interacting, and not the other side of the family who may bring a different culture, a different set of experiences, different kind of wisdom, children are limited in their repertoire of behaviours, in what they're familiar with and how they can relate to a wider range of people. So it has an important impact.
It does, and until you are a grandparent, you don't realise what that relationship is. And it's completely different from being a parent. And it's not, people will make the throwaway comment, well, you can have them when you want and then you can pass them back to their parents. That's what people say.
Commonly held, yeah.
Yes, it is, but it's not about that at all. I can still remember holding our granddaughter for the first time, and she was our first grandchild. And it was just magical. And it was completely different from when I became a mum. It was a completely different emotion altogether. And you're sitting there with this tiny little mite in your arms, and she happened to have big blue eyes, and she was looking up at me and I was looking down at her, and you suddenly realise the enormous responsibility it is of being a grandparent.
Yeah.
And did you have grandparents that you were able to have relationships with yourself?
Interestingly, one side, my mum's parents, my grandmother died when I was very young, and so I didn't really know her other than always being a grandmother that was always in bed. She was always poorly, and so I had a relationship, but I was very young. My grandfather was brilliant and wonderful, and he was a naughty grandparent. He would teach me all sorts of things inappropriate to say at inappropriate places.
Do you mean things that your parents wouldn't teach you?
Oh, absolutely not. No, but when I say naughty, I mean in the nicest possible way.
Yeah, sure.
And he was naughty with a twinkle in his eye, and I loved him dearly. And I can still see him now sitting in his chair with his cricket hat on, watching the cricket, and he was lovely. The other side of my family, myself and my brother were a bit of a nuisance, I think. So I didn't. When I say I didn't have a good relationship with them, that's not true, because I sort of didn't have a relationship with them at all. They were not into kids. They thought children were a nuisance. They were from the, children should be seen but not heard generation very much. And so I had a bit of both. And we have to acknowledge, don't we, in families, that we all have family members that we don't get on with very well.
Of course.
But you don't treat them in an appalling manner.
But also you get a wide experience of relationships, because you have the grandfather who's very close and who can teach you about stuff your parents won't mention, but is part of broadening your perspective on the world. And then you have the other grandparents who teach you something about perhaps a Victorian attitude to children, which is part of the national culture and is part of the family culture, which if you don't get that, you don't understand it.
No, you don't.
So at least you understand it, even if it's not a
yes,
warm, emotional connection.
Yeah, and I was also estranged from my father for about 15 years, so I get that as well. So I know what that bit's like too. But there isn't a rose-tinted glasses family relationship, is there? It's about...
No, that's not what it's about necessarily. It's about learning to live in the world and coping with the world.
Exactly. And your grandparents don't obviously have the responsibility of what it is to be a parent, of having to go out and work, earn the money, keep the home going, all that sort of stuff. They are very much a support network in themselves, really. But the secret with being a grandparent is to, well, think your own thoughts and not speak them, is my mantra to all grandparents. But it's about showing that you're there to give any support as and when it's needed. And that's quite a skill to learn, because it's really easy as a grandparent, having been a parent, to jump in when you see perhaps things that you wouldn't have done, or, you know, all that sort of stuff. And you do have to take a step back. But you, like being a parent, you learn on the job. You know, you realise, actually, okay, I need to just be quiet about this, because bringing up children now is completely different from when it was when I brought my boys up. You know, it's not the same. It's all done in a completely different way. So you have to acknowledge that and learn it. And at the end of the day, parents are the parents. You aren't.
Well, I mean, this is one rather modest approach to grandparenting, but I mean, just as there are lots of different ways of being a grandparent, there are also different ways of being a child, and the relationship is an individual one between grandparent and child. It doesn't have to be this self-effacing position that that, you know, you feel perhaps because of your experience you have to take. I think many children would be very grateful that they have a grandparent who pushes aside some of the rules that the parents impose.
It all depends on what sort of relationship you have with either a daughter or a daughter-in-law as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you know, that's a learning thing too, and it's as I say, it's an incredibly difficult thing to explain to anyone who hasn't become a grandparent. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I have 4 grandchildren, and I love each and every one of them. But I probably treat them all very differently, because
Yes,
they're
exactly.
different people. They are
Exactly.
little people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I'm very aware of from listening to you that it's part of a child's development, and it's part of a grandparent's development as well. But if we look at it from the child's point of view, it's experiencing another relationship which can be very important, simply as in learning how to live your life, learning how to
Yes.
conduct relationships.
And we were very fortunate that both my boys grew up with living with my mum, and they benefited from that enormously. You know, the richness, her wisdom, her humour above anything else has got them through all sorts of tight squeezes in their young lives, actually. And it's such a privilege. You know,
So-
I was very lucky. I had a brilliant relationship with my mum, as you can tell, and so that was never difficult.
Exactly. Well, it's part of the richness of life, isn't it? And to be deprived of that
Yes.
is a tremendous
Yeah.
loss, because you only have the one life, you only have the one family, and if you lose
Absolutely,
it, that's that's a huge
Yeah.
thing. So, what do you find is happening to the grandparents who've been in touch with you?
There's usually a pattern. Somebody somewhere is controlling a situation, so it's about power and control over somebody. But grandparents, you may have heard the phrase "a living bereavement," and it's a phrase that's used a lot within grandparents who are estranged from their grandchildren, and it is like a living bereavement. And what happens is that grandparents go through the 7 stages of grief, as you would if you had somebody had died within your family, and they go through exactly those stages. And what we try to do is to basically hold their hand when they're going through those different stages of grief, really. It's very hard for grandparents when, in my example, as I said just now, we were estranged from our granddaughter for over 11 years. That's very hard for a grandparent to hear who is just starting on this
It must
horrible
be.
journey.
Yeah.
And so I'm very careful about not divulging that unless directly asked, because if this has only happened to you last week, you see this decades stretched in front of you that you may not see your grandchildren, and it isn't always that. It isn't always like that. So it's important for grandparents, I think, when they contact us, is to, although I say there's a pattern, there is, but they are all unique people. So what's happening to them is unique to them. And so it's very important that when I speak to any grandparent, I don't say, oh, I've heard it all before. Because I may have done, but to that grandparent who's on the phone at that particular moment in time, it's just their world's fallen apart and their hearts are broken. They are physically broken. Grandparents will, they'll say, what can I do about it? Well, there isn't an answer to that, if I'm honest, and I am honest with grandparents. They probably at that stage have learnt that they don't have a legal automatic right to see grandchildren, but they can go down the legal route. They can apply to the court for leave to then apply for what's now called a child arrangement order.
What's their experience, Jane, of lawyers in dealing with that kind of case?
It's not great, really. We have a lawyer who supports us as a charity, and he's very honest with grandparents. And I think there are some lawyers out there who are very honest with grandparents and tell them, this is going to be a rough ride. But there are some who aren't. And so what I try to do with them is if they decide to go down the legal route, I try to give them any information I can so that they can have the information with them before they go into it. It can be very stressful, clearly. It can be very expensive. We've had grandparents who have spent their entire life savings going to court and are still not seeing their grandchildren. I think the honest truth with all of the legal part of this is, and this applies to parents as well as grandparents who are going through the family justice system, which for me it's not fit for purpose, if I'm honest. A contact order, child arrangement order, whatever you want to call it, because they keep changing their name for it.
The names, yeah.
My view is it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Because it can't be enforced, you mean?
Exactly.
Well, it isn't enforced anyway.
No, it's not enforced. And those that are going through the system, they know how to play the system, and they know there are no consequences if you break that order, which is why we've got hundreds and thousands of parents not seeing their own children and grandparents not seeing their grandchildren. Because
now, when you say it's rough, Jane, where does the roughness come from? Who is rough? Is it simply the parents fighting each other, or is it the lawyers, or is it the judiciary, or who's rough?
I think it's all of it. The whole system is just such an. Most grandparents, most people have perhaps never experienced law or the legal route or the
that's
police.
true.
That this is something very new to them.
Yeah.
And when they stand in court and have false allegations thrown at them, which happens very, very often, the most horrendous things are said about them. They can't believe. Maybe it's a generation thing, and I'm not that keen on it really, but I think it is that we do think that justice will prevail. But in the family court system, it doesn't.
When you
And
say
that's
about the
a
kind of...
huge shock.
Yes, it would be a shock. I can understand that. When you say about the kind of things that are said, are you meaning that there are allegations of child abuse?
Oh, yes.
Actual physical and sexual child abuse?
Yeah. And for any unpleasant allegation you can think of, it is said. And it will also be references to how they were brought up as children themselves, that they've had a terrible childhood, that their parents treated them badly. The whole gambit. It's just, it's an unbelievable situation, and it's certainly something I had never expected at all when I started on this, that this sort of thing happens. And I actually had a call from somebody yesterday who had written a letter to her family member saying, look, I'm really sorry about, I've obviously upset you, but can we get together? Can we talk about it? You know, as far as she read the letter to me. I couldn't see there was anything awful about it at all. And that family member contacted the police, and the police turned up at this grandparent's house. And that's not rare. You know, this happens a lot. And, you know, the birthday card that you pop through the letterbox, then you'll get the police on your doorstep. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's a complete waste of police time apart from anything else. But the minute somebody uses the word harassment, the police are duty bound to follow that up.
How often, Jane, do you come across a situation where the child, no, we're talking about grandchildren, aren't we? But the parent is the parent is united with their partner in excluding their own parents from contact with the children. Is that something which happens very much, or is it that it's the ex who is saying the grandparents shouldn't have contact?
I think it's a bit of a. I have to.
I'm trying to kind of clarify these different relationships.
Yeah. Yes, and I think I said at the beginning, you know, when I first started this, I thought this was as a result of separation and divorce.
Yes.
Yeah.
I learned very quickly that isn't the case, and actually, your own adult child denying you contact is massive.
Is that more common than exes fighting against contact, or
well,
same?
I've never actually sat and done statistics. I'm not a statistical person.
But anecdotally.
But anecdotally, I would say the calls I get, the majority are people's own adult children.
Right.
So, of course, actually, that's when family law sort of doesn't really work, because it is an assumption that if you're not seeing your grandchildren, it's because there's been a divorce and separation going on.
Yeah.
If it's your own children, it's a different thing altogether. And it can happen if somebody loses an adult child through illness or accident prematurely, the partner that's left will then deny contact with the children. So it's almost a double bereavement. So you lose your adult child prematurely. You then lose that last link of that child, which is the grandchildren.
Is that because they've gone off and married someone else?
It can be, but it isn't always.
Right.
And I'm just a grandparent and a mum and a wife. I'm not an expert in anything, but it's almost as though the spouse that's left, or partner who's left, needs to break those links themselves. They can't deal with any links of the person who has died prematurely. But of course it's awful for the children as well as the grandparents, because of course, particularly those that have had a really good relationship with their grandparents before, and then all of a sudden they may have lost mum or dad, and actually they're not seeing their grandparents either. So it's something I can't get my head around, and I don't think I ever will. I mean, I find that, it would be so interesting to talk to somebody who has felt they've had to do that, to find out why that they feel that there's that need to do that.
Do you have sorry, Jane. Do you have much experience of children these children who become adults? Do you talk to any of those about the impact it's had on them not being able to see their grandparents? Or
well, you've got your own direct experience of that, of course.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about that though. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Yes, I mean, of course, there's so many things to say about that, really. Obviously, in our case, our granddaughter decided when she was just coming up for 18. She was about 2 months off her 18th birthday, and she had fallen out with her mum, and her first port of call was to find her dad, and she contacted him after 11 years, and then obviously after he met up with her, she lives at one end of the country, we live at the other. I then gradually started to contact her in a soft way, if you like, because the last thing I wanted to do was to be involved in anything that would upset the relationship with my son being reunited with his daughter, because that's always, as a parent, that's, you know, that's what you want. You want that relationship to be reconciled, and you come, you know, second place really. And it's very difficult because I think as grandparents, when this happens, very often with our grandchildren, we worry about them daily. We think they're miserable and they're unhappy, and they are, but they're also children. You know, they're children before anything else, and children need to grow and be their own people, and they are, but in a slightly different way than you'd anticipated it was going to be. But it doesn't mean to say that they are constantly sitting in a corner crying, because they're leading their lives, which they, you know, which is absolutely what they must do. Yeah. But I think definitely it had an effect on my granddaughter. I purposely haven't had a direct conversation with her about that. What I do is, if she asks something, then I answer it. But I don't ask those questions first. I mean, the first thing I said to her when we met face to face was, if you think I'm going to badmouth your mum, I'm not going to. I haven't for 11 years, and I'm not going to do it now. And I never have, and I never will. She's still her mum, and you know, that's very important. And I'm, you know, that's a whole different thing altogether. But I could see for myself that lack of relationship with us, let me put it a different way. I think it would have benefited her a lot had she still had that relationship with us. It doesn't mean to say that it would necessarily... it's difficult, because I'm obviously looking at it from my point of view, looking in at her. And there are things that she will say, which I can't think of at the moment, but she will say things and you think, oh gosh, if I'd been around, I could have done something about that. You know, I could have helped. And I think often with these children, when this happens to them, they have been told untruths about us. And so when they actually meet us again and they realise we're actually not those people that we've been portrayed at, they can, and often do, turn against that parent because that parent's lied to them. I think they don't trust adults. They feel let down by all adults. And I think, you know, what that will do in the future to these children's own relationships is we shall have to wait and see, won't we? I have to say that, in fact, it was my granddaughter's boyfriend who instigated her reconciling with us because he'd been through a similar thing with his own parent.
Goodness.
So I think we now have a whole generation of children actually who are growing up from estrangement situations in all sorts. And so as their peers, they talk to one another about it because it's so common. And if they have somebody in their lives who have experienced it again themselves, then actually that can work to be a positive thing that they can share. Like with my granddaughter, you know, it was her boyfriend who drove her down here, and I don't know that she would have come if she hadn't had that person.
It's a very fundamental aspect of a personality, though, to learn that you can't trust adults who are part of your family.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's appalling,
it may be right not to trust some adults who are part of your family because they're a menace, and you need to learn how to recognise that and know the truth about people, and you may learn that from your family. But to be taught that you can't trust people when there's no evidence for why you shouldn't trust them, apart from the fact that somebody's saying don't, leaves you without knowing why you don't trust them, apart from whatever tales you're told.
And I suppose one of the thoughts they must have is that the grandparents aren't really interested enough to try and get to see them.
Which is another loss, of course,
absolutely.
to believe that you're not of value to your grandparents.
Exactly. And that's massive, if not the biggest thing altogether, because we all want to be valued. We all need to
Yeah.
be valued.
Well, you're part of a
And for
chain of
these,
family, aren't
Yeah.
you, down
of course you
generations?
are. And family identity is important, and they have a right to know where they come from, and all that goes with that. Um, and I think so often with these children, they become the young carer, and they become a parent's confidant. And children have to grow up in these circumstances very, very quickly, because what they, we going back, if you like, to the legal route a little bit, that you will know about wishes and feelings, that children are talked about what their wishes and feelings
The
are. And
welfare
although
checklist.
on the face of that, it sounds quite sensible. But of course, the truth of the matter is that children will say what they've been told to say. And if they are living in, if you take a decade, which we are in our case, more than, but a decade, of believing that your grandparents don't care a fig about you, that does damage,
Yeah.
enormous damage. But if you try to talk about your grandparents or mention them in any way, the resident parent you're living with gets very upset, cries, just doesn't want to talk about it. And children learn very quickly that
Oh,
the best thing
not
to
to
do is
say
A, not
anything.
mention us at
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
but also they don't want to see mum or dad upset. Of course they don't. Children hate it. It's the
Yeah.
last thing they want. I mean, I know even with my little granddaughter who's only 3, if she thinks I'm upset about anything, she gets distressed. Well, if that was happening on a regular basis, that every time a certain subject was mentioned, be that dad, if you're talking about a separation of a mum or dad or grandparents, you learn very fast. That will make mummy cry, or that will upset daddy if I talk about those people. So, okay, I'm not going to talk about them.
Yeah.
And I would do
Yeah.
everything I can to make mummy happy or daddy happy, because I can't bear to see them upset. The burden that puts on children's shoulders is immense.
Yeah. Yeah. As we were talking a little bit about the legal system, can I just revert to that again, Jane? What about Kafka's? What do you have any? You obviously don't have any direct experience of Kafka's, but what about what you're hearing about Kafka's?
Okay, no, I don't. You're right. It's all anecdotal, and it's important, of course, to say that running a support group, of course, what you don't get is you don't get people ringing you up and saying what a wonderful experience you've had with Kafka, because clearly that isn't what a support group is
We
for.
haven't heard much of that either, Jane. No.
No, I know, but usually. The relationship between a grandparent and Kafkas is not good, and often, even grandparents who have actually been bringing grandchildren up for a period of time, and they've been taking the kids to school every day and all that sort of business, they will still get a bad report from Kafkas. So I have to say, anecdotally, it's not good, but I also know of several Kafkas officers in a different way, on a personal level, and they are brilliant. They are brilliant. But of course, at the end of the day, it's the judge that makes that decision.
Yeah, of course. But they do tend to rely on Kafka's officers a lot, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And again, it gets back to, although, they talk about, it's been very much in the public eye about parental alienation of recent months because of the domestic abuse bill thing, going through the House of Lords. And Kafkas, are supposed to get training in parental alienation, etc., etc. But I still say, I worked with children for 15 years as well. I was a teaching assistant, and so I know how kids can react to different people. And again, although you might have training to have red flags, if you like, kids are very good at going around those red flags as well. So again, the children will, if they're being asked questions, they will know the right things to say. So it's a flawed system in a way. I think there has to be much more training throughout the whole legal services. Needs much more training about estrangement because it is such a massive issue. So yes, anecdotally, I honestly can't say that I get marvellous responses about how CAFCAS have dealt with them. And I think very often social workers, unfortunately, will very often treat grandparents also really badly. And that, you know, some of the things that I do here are unbelievable. And obviously, every call I have is covered by confidentiality. So, you know, I would never go into detail about that. But it's quite shocking. You know, the things that are supposed to have happened, you know, the example, and you've probably heard the example before. I mean, I had a situation which goes on from the example that's used about broccoli very often, but I had a situation where somebody was giving her child heritage carrots a lot, and of course they're purple. And it got to the state, the whole thing got completely out of control to, you know, you shouldn't be giving that person purple carrots, to the child then picking up on that by saying, actually, somebody's trying to kill me because they're giving me purple carrots. You know,
it's terribly good, isn't it?
The whole
It's gone
system,
kind
the
of
system
mad.
is bonkers. And, you know, under normal circumstances, we laugh about that sort of thing. But the reality, that sort of thing is going to court.
What's bizarre? What's bizarre about hearing you, Jane, is that both Jill and I worked a lot in the public law arena, where children are facing long-term fostering or adoption because of serious parenting failures, very serious, which have reached the stage of permanent separation, possibly, of the child. And in those circumstances, grandparents are very often regarded as the saving grace for the children.
They are.
And are placed with grandparents, even in families where the grandparent has quite clearly been neglectful of the actual parent, which is why the parenting is failing, of course, or even abusive of the parent who's failing. But the children get placed with the grandparent because it's seen as being cheaper. In the interests of the cheaper, okay, but but nevertheless, it's a kind of reversal of what you're talking about.
I know.
And you know, when there's a careful assessment and people really appraise the interests of the child, the grandparents are seen as a tremendously valuable resource.
Yes, and yet I often have grandparents who will contact us who are in situations where their grandchildren are up for adoption. And they've put their names forward because they would like to bring the grandchildren up, and you know it's not successful.
Really?
Well, yes. Each case has got its own mysteries, but certainly we've seen plenty of cases where I'd be thinking, my goodness, this grandparent's not got a terribly good track record, but nevertheless, you know, is seen as the saviour for the child, and quite rightly in the end, because the alternatives are worse.
Yes.
But the private family law seems to be run on a completely different basis, where
yes, it is.
Any little objection seems to be treated as a, you know, kind of massive event.
Yes, it is, and actually, of course, what happens is that parents who are going through this denying contact, they're looking for those things all the time, like the purple carrot situation.
Broccoli.
And you know they will pick those things up, and I suppose that's where my mantra of think your own thoughts but never speak them comes into it, really.
Yes,
because
of course.
If you've got somebody who is trying to look for control, they will be waiting for you to say or do something that they can use at a later date. And so if you say nothing, then people can't. But
isn't it?
You don't play the game.
It's extraordinary, though, that the professionals get involved and het up about things like that.
And people are spending a lot of money trying to pursue their relationship with their grandchildren.
Yes.
But we were talking to Sally Ann Burris recently, who piloted a treatment program for families called Restorative Change, in which care is taken to actually understand the problem, who is doing what to whom, and
it's a whole family approach,
and the wider families involved, and
the children
and the children, And clearly that requires an investment of effort. But on the other hand, people are spending a lot of money fighting each other in the courts, and you could spend the money more wisely in taking a care to actually understand what's happening within a family so as to prioritise the children's needs, their real needs, rather than some pretended need by a parent who's got an axe to grind. But you're not seeing any of that available, I don't suppose, to the families.
Nothing, no. And you know, everybody now knows about parental alienation. Everybody now knows about estrangement. It has, you know, the public awareness has grown enormously in the 14 years that, you know, I've been involved in it.
But it seems to be a topic, Jane, that people are frightened to, you know, the mention of the word parental alienation apparently is, well,
which is why I
people
don't
are being
use it.
It's toxic.
You know, yes, it's toxic.
I don't use it.
Yeah.
It's a toxic thing to do. Parental alienation area is a toxic world to be in. And we have to be using different terminology.
Well, Jill and I are wading deep into it. We carelessly.
Marvellous. The thing is, we know we know the result of estrangement, don't we? We know that it affects
I think it's a very good word to use, different word, yeah.
And so we know that. What we need to be doing is preventing it happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So multi-agencies need to be involved really, really quickly when this sort of thing happens.
Yeah.
So that they can nip it in the bud and work together. Like, you know, you were saying about families coming together to say, okay, let's thrash this out. What is the actual issue? That, you know,
you need an umpire to manage that.
Yeah.
Of course you do. So that's why the whole thing really needs to be thrown up in the air and looked at again as to how we... Because at the end of the day, and the most important thing for me, and always has been, is the welfare and well-being of children.
Yes.
And we are doing a great disservice to millions of children because we are not working with whoever there might be who can prevent this happening in the first place. So,
and I think it has to be asked, Jane, because of what we've just said, though. You're not suggesting, are you, that dangerous parents should have contact with children, nor that dangerous grandparents should have
of course
contact.
Not.
No.
And actually, as an organisation, grandparents have to acknowledge that there may well be some grandparents who should have nothing to do with their grandchildren for all those reasons you've just said.
Yeah.
For safeguarding reasons.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge that. Equally, there are some parents who should have nothing to do with their children for the same reasons. So having acknowledged that, that's the minority.
Yeah.
The majority of people are, you know, ordinary people trying to do their best. And for whatever reason, it goes badly wrong. And what we're here for is to sort of pick up the pieces and just try to pull people through, you know, what is an incredibly difficult time for them.
Well, we're very impressed, Jane, and we're very grateful that you spent the time explaining about it. And
I think your calm approach, Jane, is what's required. You don't need people to try and heat up the situations to make it worse. And clearly you have a very measured response. And I would imagine getting involved with you at a stage when you're feeling devastated would be a great help to people. I can see that.
Well, I hope so. And we're dealing with families who are in conflict of some sort. Mm. And it would be very easy for me to fan those flames. But
of course.
There is no point in doing that. We've got to be here to just, as I said earlier on, really, to hold out those hands when it's necessary to do that, and just to let people know they're not on their own, and that we'll walk them through it.
And you don't mind if people contact you from all over the UK?
No, and beyond. I mean, we get people from all over the world contacting us, actually.
Excellent.
So no, absolutely not a problem.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. That's very, very helpful, very interesting.
Really interesting, and thank you.
You're very welcome.
We'll talk to you again, perhaps.
Indeed, that will be lovely. Right. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.